Alright, let's go. Number 10. Hamen Manga. In 2011, a team from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences began excavating a Neolithic settlement in Inner Mongolia, a site dating to approximately 3000 BCE, belonging to the Hongshan Cultural Complex. The settlement comprised 29 semi-subterranean pit houses, arranged in a pattern consistent with a functioning community. Grain storage pits, evidence of pottery production. Animal bone deposits indicating a mixed agricultural and pastoral economy. Then they entered House F4O. 97 individuals were found in a single room, not arranged, not buried, not ritually placed, stacked. The skeletal analysis, published in 2015 in the Chinese Journal of Archaeology, documented multiple age cohorts, children, working-age adults, and elderly individuals, all in a single structure measuring approximately 37 square meters. That is 2.6 bodies per square meter. The modern legal capacity of an elevator is 0.3 people per square meter. No defensive wounds were identified, no fire damage to bone, no signs of violence. Whatever entered House F4O did not announce itself. The bodies were not buried. The building was sealed, the settlement was then abandoned and never reoccupied. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The sealing of the building was deliberate. Someone survived, someone returned to the settlement, sealed the house containing 97 of their dead, and chose never to come back. The abandonment was not the result of the epidemic alone, it was the result of fear of something still present. Whatever the survivors believed was in that settlement was frightening enough that they forfeited everything: structures, tools, grain stores, the accumulated physical investment of a functioning community, rather than return. The Hongshan Cultural Complex, which had produced some of the most sophisticated ritual objects in prehistoric Northeast Asia, elaborate jade dragons, ceremonial vessels, astronomical alignments, disappears from the archaeological record shortly after this period. Whether Hamen Mangha represents an isolated outbreak or the visible edge of a larger collapse is unknown. The settlement's abandonment is total and permanent. The culture that built it did not persist in recognizable form. No pathogen responsible for Hamen Mangha has ever been identified. The soil preservation conditions did not permit ancient DNA extraction of the causative agent. An epidemic fast enough to leave 97 unburied bodies in a single room, frightening enough that survivors never returned. And we have no idea what caused it. Whatever organism moved through House F4O in 3000 BCE has no confirmed modern equivalent. It may have been a variant of something we recognize. It may have been something that no longer exists in its original form. It may still exist exactly as it did, waiting in a reservoir we have not yet identified. The settlement of Hamen Mangha was sealed, abandoned, and forgotten for 5,000 years. The pathogen left no record. Number 9. Plague of Athens, 430 BCE. The Spartans were besieging Athens. The Athenians, following the strategy of Pericles, had retreated behind the long walls and abandoned the countryside, allowing the Spartan army to ravage Attica unchallenged while the Athenian navy struck Spartan coastal holdings. It was a rational strategy. It was working. Then something arrived through the port at Piraeus. Thucydides, who contracted the disease, recovered, and survived to write its history, produced the first clinical description of an epidemic in recorded history. He was deliberate about why. I shall simply set down the nature of it and explain the symptoms by which perhaps it may be recognized by those who see it in the future. In 2006, Manolis Papagiannopoulos and colleagues at the University of Athens published findings in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases from dental pulp DNA extracted from skeletal remains at the Keramakos Cemetery, a mass burial site dated to the epidemic. The identified pathogen: Salmonella enterica typhimurium, typhoid fever. Thucydides' description: severe head pain, reddened eyes, sneezing, sore throat, violent coughing, uncontrollable vomiting, and gangrenous extremities in survivors, matches the clinical presentation of typhoid with secondary complications. The epidemic swept through a population that had been compressed inside city walls with limited access to clean water. The conditions for typhoid transmission were ideal. The density of the refugee population made containment impossible. Athens in 430 BCE had a population of approximately 250,000 to 300,000, including war refugees who had crowded inside the walls. The epidemic killed between 75,000 and 100,000 people, roughly 25% of the total population. It killed 4 of Athens' 10 generals in its first year. It killed Pericles, the architect of Athenian democracy and the Long Wall strategy, in 429 BCE. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The traditional account frames the Plague of Athens as one factor among many in Athens' eventual defeat. The data suggests something more fundamental. Athens did not merely lose Pericles, it lost the entire political and intellectual generation that Pericles represented. Thucydides describes the social breakdown precisely. The catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen to them next, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. Sacred and profane, legal and illegal. The distinctions that had organized Athenian civil life for generations dissolved within months. The funeral ceremony Pericles had delivered in 431 BCE, laying out the principles of Athenian democracy, described a city that no longer existed by 429 BCE. Athens never again held the strategic initiative in the Greek world. The Sicilian expedition of 415 BCE, the catastrophic overreach that destroyed Athenian naval supremacy, was ordered by a democracy that had lost the generation that built the Parthenon, the Long Walls, and the institutional culture of Periclean Athens. Pericles had spent 30 years creating the preconditions for Athenian hegemony. The plague erased the institutional knowledge he embodied in a single year. What Athens produced after 430 BCE was never again what it had been before. Thucydides noted one additional detail that has attracted less attention than the clinical description. Those who recovered from the plague gained partial immunity and became the only people willing to care for the sick. Everyone else fled. The epidemic created a stratified society of immune and non-immune within the city's walls. This mechanism, disease creating social stratification between the recovered and the vulnerable, has been documented in every subsequent major epidemic. The Plague of Athens is the first recorded instance of a phenomenon that still governs how societies fracture under biological pressure. It has not stopped. Number 8. Antonine Plague. 165 CE, Roman legions under Lucius Verus had just sacked the Parthian city of Seleucia on the Tigris. The city had offered to surrender. The Romans sacked it anyway, violating what amounted to a diplomatic agreement. As the legions marched home through the eastern provinces, they carried something that no Roman fortification, no Roman law, and no Roman military doctrine was designed to counter. Within 18 months of the legions' return, the epidemic had spread to every province of the empire from Syria to Britain. The Antonine Plague was almost certainly smallpox, variola major. The physician Galen, who treated soldiers and civilians during the epidemic and whose clinical notes survive, described symptoms matching smallpox with precision. High fever, skin eruptions, diarrhea, pustules progressing to black scabs that fell away to leave scarred tissue. Galen called it the Great Plague. He was sufficiently frightened that he left Rome during the epidemic's peak in 166 CE, one of the few instances in his career in which he chose survival over clinical observation. The epidemic killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people across the Roman Empire. Mortality rates in some military units exceeded 30%. At the epidemic's peak, the Antonine Plague was killing an estimated 2,000 people per day in Rome alone. That is 730,000 deaths per year in a single city. The Roman legions, which required approximately 150,000 active-duty soldiers to hold the northern and eastern frontiers, were so severely depleted that Emperor Marcus Aurelius was forced to take an action without precedent in Roman military history. He recruited Germanic barbarians directly into the legions as foederati, fighting under Roman command, but retaining their own unit structures and leadership. He had no choice. The epidemic had consumed the citizen soldier base that had built the Roman military tradition over 5 centuries. What makes this particularly disturbing isn't the death count, it's the precedent. Marcus Aurelius's decision to recruit foederati under Roman command created a structural dependency that outlasted the epidemic by 3 centuries. Every subsequent Roman emperor inherited a military model that required barbarian recruitment to function. The army that sacked Rome in 410 CE under Alaric, an army of Visigoths fighting under a commander who had served as a Roman officer, was not fundamentally different in structure from the army Marcus Aurelius assembled to replace his plague-depleted legions in 166 CE. He did not have a choice, but the choice he was forced to make redefined what Rome was. Lucius Verus, Marcus Aurelius's co-emperor, died of the plague in 169 CE. Marcus Aurelius survived, but the Meditations, the private philosophical journal he kept during the epidemic years, are not the work of a man at peace. Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. He was not writing philosophy in the academic sense. He was writing in the presence of constant death, attempting to maintain cognitive and moral function in a city where the dead were a daily condition of governance. The empire he inherited was not the empire he governed. and the empire he governed was not the empire he left. The Antonine Plague began when soldiers carried a pathogen home from a military campaign against a foreign power in a distant theater. Smallpox was eradicated in 1980. Two official stockpiles remain, one at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, one at the Vector Institute in Novosibirsk. Both are under international treaty supervision. The mechanism that brought smallpox to Rome in 165 CE has not changed. Number 7, Plague of Cyprian, 249 CE. The Roman Empire was already fracturing. Emperor Decius had just launched a systematic persecution of Christians, the first empire-wide persecution requiring documented sacrifice to Roman gods on pain of death. Then something arrived in Ethiopia, or possibly Egypt, and moved north. It was unlike anything Roman physicians had seen. Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria wrote that it killed, without distinction of age, the young and strong are swept away with those who are aged and feeble. Bishop Cyprian of Carthage, for whom the epidemic is named, wrote a description of symptoms so specific and so disturbing that no modern physician has been able to assign them with certainty to any known pathogen. Symptoms described by Cyprian: violent diarrhea, continuous vomiting, high fever, gangrenous extremities, conjunctival hemorrhage, throat ulceration, and internal hemorrhaging visible through the skin. In 2013 and 2014, excavations at Luxor, Egypt, by the Italian Archaeological Mission, uncovered what appears to be an emergency burial site from the epidemic. Bodies covered in lime, sealed chambers, pottery vessels containing lime mixed with a disinfectant compound. The disinfection protocol itself is evidence. Whoever managed these burials understood, at some level, that the dead were a transmission vector. The pathogen has never been isolated from these remains. Leading hypotheses include a viral hemorrhagic fever, similar to Ebola or Marburg virus, an extinct form of pandemic influenza, or a pathogen with no modern equivalent. We do not know what it was. At its peak in Rome, the Plague of Cyprian killed an estimated 5,000 people per day. For comparison, the Black Death killed approximately 200 people per day in London at its worst. The Cyprian Plague's Roman peak mortality rate was 25 times higher. The epidemic lasted 13 years, from 249 to 262 CE. Estimated total dead across the empire, 25 to 50 million. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Historians typically present the Plague of Cyprian as one pressure among many during the crisis of the 3rd century. The 50-year period between 235 and 284 CE, during which Rome experienced 26 emperors, most of whom died violently, and during which the empire simultaneously faced barbarian incursions, economic collapse, and military fragmentation. The plague is listed as a contributing factor, then it is moved past. What is almost never stated clearly is the causative sequence. The plague did not occur during the crisis of the 3rd century. It caused it. Emperor Justinian died of the plague in 251 CE. Emperor Claudius II died of it in 270 CE. The plague is estimated to have killed an indeterminate but significant portion of the Roman Senate during its peak years. It did not merely weaken imperial institutions. It physically eliminated the people who ran them. Rome entered 249 CE as the uncontested dominant power of the Mediterranean world. It exited the crisis of the 3rd century in 284 CE as a permanently diminished entity that had already lost effective administrative continuity in its western frontier provinces, undergone catastrophic currency debasement, and suffered the first permanent division of imperial command. The Plague of Cyprian is not traditionally identified as the primary cause of Rome's eventual fall. But the Rome that fell in 476 CE was not the Rome of 248 CE. The epidemic is the gap between those two entities. The pathogen responsible for the Plague of Cyprian has never been identified. If it was a viral hemorrhagic fever, which the symptom description most closely resembles, then what occurred between 249 and 262 CE was a hemorrhagic virus achieving sustained pandemic spread across a densely urbanized, globally connected civilization. The Roman road network, which Rome had built as its greatest infrastructure achievement over 4 centuries, became the most efficient disease transmission system the ancient world had ever produced. The infrastructure of connection is always the infrastructure of contagion. This principle has not changed. Number 6, the Hittite Plague. 1335 BCE, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I had just completed the most successful military campaign in Hittite history, a multi-year sweep through Syria that shattered Egyptian influence across the Levant and made the Hittites the dominant military power in the Near East. His soldiers came home carrying something from the Egyptian or Levantine populations they had fought, besieged, and absorbed. What followed is recorded in the Plague Prayers of Mursili II, one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient Near East. They are not prayers in the conventional sense. They are a clinical, analytical, desperate interrogation of why a god would allow an epidemic to continue for 20 years, and what specific violations of divine law might explain it. The Hittite plague lasted approximately 20 years, from roughly 1335 to 1315 BCE. It killed Suppiluliuma I, the greatest military ruler in Hittite history, within approximately 1 year of his return from the Egyptian campaign. It then killed his son and designated successor, Arnawanda II, within months of his coronation. The succession crisis required 2 years of instability to resolve before Mursili II secured the throne. The pathogen has not been identified from surviving remains. The plague prayers document only its duration, its scope, and its victims. Mursili II wrote that the epidemic had consumed countless Hittites. The actual count was apparently too large or too disturbing to enumerate. Based on Hittite administrative and military records, modern estimates suggest the plague killed between 1/4 and 1/3 of the Hittite Empire's total population over its 20-year duration. The Hittite Empire, at its maximum extent, controlled approximately 800,000 square kilometers, roughly the combined area of modern Turkey and Syria. Its population is estimated at 2 to 3 million. A 25 to 33% mortality rate represents 500,000 to 1 million deaths. The military consequences were immediate and permanent. Mursili II, who finally stabilized the throne, spent his entire reign on the defensive, struggling to hold what his father had won, rather than extending Hittite control. The Hittites never again launched an offensive campaign of the scale of Suppiluliuma's Syrian conquest. Consider the implication. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in 1274 BCE between Ramesses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, is the earliest recorded military engagement for which we have detailed accounts from both sides. It is conventionally described as a tactical draw that produced a negotiated peace, the earliest surviving diplomatic treaty in recorded history. What is almost never noted is the context. Muwatalli II was fighting with an empire still demographically recovering, 60 years later, from a plague that had killed 2 kings in succession. The Hittite military that fought Ramesses at Kadesh was not the Hittite military that had swept through Syria under Suppiluliuma. The epidemic created the conditions for the stalemate. The stalemate produced the treaty. The treaty is cited as evidence of Hittite diplomatic sophistication. The chain of causation begins with a pathogen. The deeper loss was institutional. Suppiluliuma I had spent 30 years building the Hittite diplomatic apparatus. The clay tablet archives at Hattusa contain his correspondence with Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Ugarit, and Cyprus. He understood the diplomatic relationships of the Near East at a level that could not be reconstructed from documents alone. The plague killed him before he could transmit that understanding. His son died before he could inherit it. Mursili II spent his reign reconstructing Hittite foreign policy from clay tablets, written by a man whose expertise he never received. The Plague Prayers are, among other things, a record of an empire attempting to understand its own diplomatic position after losing the person who understood it. The mechanism is not ancient. A military campaign exposes an immunologically naive population to a pathogen carried by a foreign population with prior exposure. The same sequence killed Alexander the Great's forces in India, carried disease from Central Asia to Europe along the Mongol trade routes, and killed more soldiers in the First World War than artillery. The Hittites documented it in cuneiform in 1322 BCE. The documentation has not prevented the pattern from repeating. Number 5. The Justinianic Plague. 541 CE. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian I was within years of completing the most ambitious political project in centuries, the reunification of the Roman Empire. His general, Belisarius, had retaken North Africa from the Vandals in 533 CE and reconquered Italy from the Ostrogoths by 540 CE. For the first time since 476 CE, a Roman emperor controlled Rome, Carthage, and the entire Mediterranean coastline. Then, in the spring of 541 CE, ships arriving at the Egyptian port of Pelusium carried grain, and grain rats, and something else. By autumn, it had reached Constantinople. The Justinianic Plague was the first pandemic of Yersinia pestis. Ancient DNA analysis, published in 2013 in the Lancet Infectious Diseases, conducted by researchers at the University of Sydney and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, confirmed Yersinia pestis from skeletal remains at 6th century European burial sites. The strain belonged to the same ancestral lineage as the Black Death bacterium identified in 14th century remains. Procopius, court historian and eyewitness in Constantinople, described the symptoms: swollen lymph nodes at the groin, armpit, and behind the ears, the classic buboes of bubonic plague, followed by delirium, coma, and vomiting of blood. He recorded the death rate in Constantinople at its peak, 10,000 per day. At 10,000 deaths daily, the Byzantine capital was losing approximately 2% of its population every 24 hours. Justinian ordered mass graves dug outside the walls. When the graves filled, he ordered towers erected, packed with corpses, and sealed. The capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was being dismantled systematically. The Byzantine Empire lost between 25 and 50 million people across the first wave alone. The pandemic then continued in recurrent waves for 2 centuries. At least 18 identified recurrences between 541 and 750 CE, each wave striking a population that had not fully recovered from the previous one. The cumulative demographic effect across the epidemic's full duration has been estimated at a 40 to 50% reduction in the Byzantine population. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Justinian's failed reconquest is typically discussed as a strategic overreach, too expensive, too ambitious, ultimately abandoned by successors who lacked his vision. This framing misses the causation. Justinian did not choose to abandon the reconquest. The plague abandoned it for him. By 544 CE, 3 years into the epidemic, the Byzantine military was so depleted that it could no longer garrison the Italian territories it had spent a decade winning. The Lombards entered Italy in 568 CE, 27 years after the plague arrived in Constantinople, and established the last Germanic kingdom on the peninsula. The western Mediterranean coastline that Justinian had spent 15 years and enormous resources to reunify under Roman authority fragmented again within a generation of his death. Italy would not be politically unified again until 1861. The plague did not merely stop Justinian's project. It redrew the map of European civilization for 1,300 years. There is a second implication that receives insufficient attention. The Islamic expansion of the 630s CE struck a Byzantine empire that had been subjected to continuous epidemic pressure for nearly a century. At the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE, the engagement that broke Byzantine control of the Levant and opened the Middle East to the Rashidun Caliphate. The Byzantine army fielded an estimated 15,000 to 40,000 soldiers. Before the Justinianic Plague, the Byzantine military could field multiples of that number in a single theater. The armies of the early Islamic expansion did not conquer the Byzantine Empire at its historical strength. They encountered a civilization that had been continuously dying for 95 years. The sequencing of the ancient DNA also produced an unexpected finding. The bacterium that caused the Justinianic Plague, the Black Death, and the third pandemic, which began in Yunnan Province, China in 1855, are all descended from a single ancestral lineage. Yersinia pestis is not a historical pathogen contained in the past. There are currently 1,000 to 2,000 confirmed human plague cases reported annually across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The third pandemic never ended. It became endemic. The organism that collapsed the Byzantine Empire is still present, still viable, still circulating in wild rodent populations on 4 continents. It has simply become too small to notice. Number 4. Cocoliztli, 1519 CE. Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico with 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a pathogen. The smallpox epidemic that followed his arrival killed an estimated 5 to 8 million Aztecs, roughly a third of the indigenous population of central Mexico, and destroyed Aztec military resistance before the Spanish had to win a single, strategically decisive engagement. That story has been told. This is not that story. In 1545, 26 years after the conquest, after the survivors of smallpox had begun to rebuild under colonial rule, something else arrived. Something that smallpox had not brought. Something that the Spanish did not recognize and could not name. They recorded what they saw. In Nahuatl, the indigenous population called it Cocoliztli, pestilence. In 2018, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, led by Oshild Vagin, published findings in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Ancient DNA had been extracted from skeletal remains in a mass burial cemetery at Tepozcolula, Yucunda, a site where victims of the 1545 epidemic had been interred in conditions that suggested extreme mortality pressure. Bodies stacked in layers without individual burial preparation, at depths indicating rapid sequential filling. The identified pathogen, Salmonella enterica paratyphi C. Enteric fever, a typhoid-like systemic infection transmitted through contaminated food and water. Contemporary Spanish accounts had described symptoms including high fever, severe headache, black tongue, dark urine, neurological deterioration, and hemorrhaging from the eyes, nose, and mouth. The 2018 identification confirmed those accounts and resolved a 470-year medical mystery. The 1545 to 1548 Cocoliztli outbreak killed an estimated 5 to 15 million people. The central Mexico population, which had stood at approximately 25 million before European contact in 1519, fell to approximately 1 million by 1600. The Cocoliztli epidemics of 1545 to 1548 and 1576 to 1578 together killed more people than all other post-contact epidemics in Mexico combined. At its peak, Cocoliztli was killing more people in central Mexico per year than the Black Death killed in Europe per year during its worst phase. The truly disturbing aspect isn't what Cocoliztli killed, it's what it killed twice. The Aztec civilization that smallpox struck in 1519 still had its institutional structures, its priests, its calendar keepers, its Pochteka merchant class, its agricultural specialists, its administrative hierarchy. 26 years of colonial disruption had degraded those structures. The civilization that Cocoliztli struck in 1545 was not the civilization of 1519. It was a wounded version of it. Cocoliztli did not kill the Aztec Empire. It killed the survivors of the first attempt to kill it. Franciscan friar Toribio de Benavente Motolinia, who witnessed the 1545 epidemic, wrote, "They died in heaps, like bedbugs." The archaeological evidence at Tepozcolula Yucundaa confirms the description. Bodies stacked in layers, mass grave conditions, no individual burial preparation, identical in configuration to the Haman Mangha site 4,500 years earlier, in a different hemisphere under a different pathogen. The convergence is not coincidence, it is the signature of mortality fast enough to outpace ceremony. The cause of Cocoliztli was unknown for 470 years. The most widely accepted hypothesis for most of that period was a hemorrhagic fever of unidentified type. The 2018 identification of Salmonella paratyphi C resolved that question and produced a new one. Enteric fever at epidemic scale requires contaminated water supply and disrupted sanitation infrastructure. The Aztec water management system, the causeways, the aqueducts, the Chinampas agricultural network had been substantially destroyed during and after the conquest. The epidemic was not purely biological. It was biological catastrophe amplified by infrastructure destruction. Whatever the indigenous population of central Mexico might have transmitted to subsequent generations, its astronomical knowledge, its agricultural techniques, its medical pharmacology, died with the people who held it. The knowledge did not survive in written form, it survived in people. The epidemic killed the people. Number 3, the Black Death, October 1347. 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina, Sicily. The sailors aboard were dead or dying. Black swellings the size of eggs had erupted in their groins and armpits. Dark blood was oozing from their skin. Sicilian port authorities ordered the fleet immediately back to sea. It was already too late. The rats had left the ships before the order arrived. Yersinia pestis was already in Messina. Within 6 years, it would kill between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, the single largest demographic catastrophe in the continent's recorded history. The Black Death was bubonic plague, confirmed by ancient DNA analysis published in 2011 by Stephanie Hainch and colleagues in PLOS Pathogens, extracted from skeletal remains at 4 European burial sites dated to the epidemic. The primary transmission vector was Zinipacilla chaopis, the oriental rat flea, carried by Rattus rattus, the black rat, which had traveled the Silk Road trade routes from the Central Asian steppe into European port cities. Secondary transmission occurred via pneumonic plague when the bacterium colonized the lungs and became airborne via respiratory droplet. The pneumonic form kills faster and requires no flea intermediary. Both forms were present simultaneously during the Black Death. Total dead, estimated at 75 to 200 million globally, with Europe losing between 30 and 60% of its population in the first wave. Some regional populations lost 80% or more. The population of Europe in 1340 was approximately 75 million. By 1400, it had fallen to approximately 50 million, and some estimates place it considerably lower. The European population did not recover to pre-plague levels until the early 17th century, more than 250 years after the Black Death's first wave. For comparison, the First World War killed approximately 2% of the global population. The Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of a continent in 6 years. Consider the implication. The Black Death is taught as the defining catastrophe of medieval Europe, and so it was. But the standard framing tends to obscure what specifically was destroyed. The European intellectual tradition in the 14th century was transmitted almost entirely through monastic communities and cathedral schools. The Black Death killed monks at higher rates than the general population. They were concentrated in shared dormitories, performing last rites for the dying, and operating the hospitals that served as the primary medical infrastructure of their communities. The University of Paris lost 1/3 of its faculty between 1348 and 1350. The papal court at Avignon, the administrative center of Western Christianity, lost 90 of its 450 members. The epidemic did not merely reduce the population. It disproportionately killed the people responsible for transmitting knowledge across generations. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence during the outbreak, described the dissolution of every social bond. Brothers abandoned brothers, uncles abandoned nephews, sisters abandoned brothers, and wives abandoned husbands. What is even worse, fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children, as though they did not belong to them. Boccaccio was documenting not moral failure, but biological logic. Proximity to the infected was death. The social behaviors that had organized European civilization, caregiving, assembly, religious practice, commerce, became transmission vectors. Every structure of normal life had to be suspended to survive. The social contract was not merely damaged, it was temporarily annulled. And from the annulment came transformation. The mass death created labor shortages that drove wages up across Europe, accelerating the dissolution of serfdom and the end of the feudal economic structure that had organized the continent for centuries. The collapse of clerical authority during the epidemic, priests who fled, last rites not administered, theological explanations that satisfied no one, produced religious skepticism on a scale that had no prior European precedent. The intellectual vacuum left by dead scholars and monks created conditions for the printing press, for vernacular literature, for the questioning of received authority that would eventually produce the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Europe that existed after 1400 was not the Europe that existed before 1347. The plague did not merely kill the old civilization, it created the conditions for the new one. Whether that constitutes recovery is a question of definition. The pathogen that produced the Black Death is still present. Yersinia pestis circulates in wild rodent populations across Central Asia, the American Southwest, Madagascar, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The third pandemic, which began in Yunnan province in 1855 and spread to every inhabited continent by the early 20th century, killed approximately 12 million people before declining in the 1950s. It did not end. It became endemic. Between 1,000 and 2,000 human plague cases are reported annually to the World Health Organization. The organism that killed 30 to 60% of Europe has simply become too familiar to be alarming. Number 2, the America's Great Dying. In 1492, an estimated 60 million people lived in the Americas. That figure is the most conservative estimate produced by modern demographic analysis. Higher estimates place the pre-contact population at 90 to 100 million. By 1650, the indigenous population of the Americas had fallen to approximately 6 million. The mathematics of this collapse have been understood for decades. The implications have not been fully absorbed. No war in human history, no famine, no other epidemic produced demographic loss of this speed, this scale, and this permanence. The largest demographic catastrophe in the recorded history of the human species occurred in the Western Hemisphere between 1492 and 1650, and it was caused primarily by biology. The mortality was not the result of a single epidemic. It was the result of sequential and overlapping introductions of Eurasian pathogens into populations with no prior immunological exposure. Variola major, smallpox, Yersinia pestis, measles, epidemic typhus, influenza, diphtheria, chickenpox, Salmonella paratyphi C. These pathogens arrived in waves, each wave striking populations already immunocompromised by the previous one. The first smallpox epidemic in Mexico, 1519 to 1521, killed an estimated 5 to 8 million people. The Cocoliztli epidemic of 1545 to 1548 killed 5 to 15 million more. A second Cocoliztli wave in 1576 to 1578 killed another 2 to 4 million. Smallpox, measles, and influenza continued in repeated epidemic cycles through the 16th and 17th centuries across North, Central, and South America. The mechanisms of individual mortality varied. The scale did not. In 2019, Alexander Koch and colleagues at University College London published findings in Quaternary Science Reviews. The demographic collapse of the Americas after 1492 resulted in the abandonment of approximately 56 million hectares of previously cultivated agricultural land. The reforestation of this land sequestered approximately 7.4 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This carbon sequestration is now identified as a significant contributing factor to the temperature drop of the Little Ice Age, the global cooling event that affected the Northern Hemisphere between approximately 1550 and 1850 CE. The deaths of 54 million people removed enough agricultural activity from the global carbon cycle to measurably cool Earth's climate. The catastrophe was not merely demographic, it was geophysical. Here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The conventional narrative of the Americas collapse centers on conquest. Cortés and his 500 soldiers, Pizarro and his 168 men defeating the Inca Empire. The conquest narrative is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that fundamentally changes the interpretation. Hernán Cortés arrived at Tenochtitlan in 1519 to find a city of approximately 300,000 people, larger than any city in Europe at the time, served by aqueducts, causeways, and a food distribution system of considerable sophistication. He was driven out of the city by force in June 1520, an engagement known as the Noche Triste, and was not in a position to take it militarily. The smallpox epidemic arrived inside Tenochtitlan in September 1520. It killed Cuitlahuac, the Aztec emperor who had expelled Cortés within months of his coronation. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in April 1521. Cortés did not conquer Tenochtitlan. He besieged a city that was already dying. What the epidemics destroyed was not merely population. The Americas in 1492 contained the accumulated agricultural knowledge of 10,000 years of settled civilization. The domestication of maize, potato, tomato, cacao, rubber, tobacco, quinoa, manioc, and dozens of other crops that now form the nutritional base of the modern world. The 3,000 indigenous languages spoken in the Americas in 1492 have been reduced to approximately 800, most of which are critically endangered. Each language carried within it a body of ecological and pharmacological knowledge, specific to the environments its speakers had inhabited for centuries. Amazon ethnobotanists have identified medicinal plant compounds from indigenous Amazonian traditional knowledge that have produced cancer treatments, anticoagulants, and antimalarial compounds. The knowledge of how to identify, prepare, and administer those compounds largely died in the 16th and 17th centuries. The epidemics did not merely reduce a population. They destroyed the library built over 10,000 years of human presence in the Western Hemisphere. The Koch et al. Finding that the deaths of 54 million people measurably cooled Earth's climate is perhaps the most disturbing single data point on this list. It means that human population and human land use are embedded in Earth's climate system at a scale that operates in both directions. The demographic collapse of the Americas contributed to global cooling. The implications for a civilization currently expanding population and atmospheric CO2 simultaneously should be considered with that precedent in mind. Number 1. The Yamnaya replacement. In 2015, a study published in Nature by David Reich and colleagues at Harvard Medical School, analyzing ancient DNA from 69 Bronze Age skeletons across Europe, identified something that mainstream archaeology had no framework to explain. Between approximately 3100 and 2700 BCE, within a period of 400 years, the genetic composition of the European population underwent a replacement so rapid and so complete that it is structurally comparable, in both speed and demographic scale, only to the collapse of indigenous populations in the Americas after 1492. The Neolithic farming populations that had built the megalithic monuments of Western Europe, the longhouse villages of Central Europe, the Neolithic flint mines of Britain and Scandinavia, populations that had been genetically dominant across Europe for 3,000 years, were replaced. In Northern Europe, they were replaced so thoroughly that modern populations carry only 25 to 40% Neolithic farmer ancestry. The rest is Yamnaya. The question this finding has not yet produced a fully satisfying answer to is, what killed them fast enough to make this possible? The Yamnaya were steppe pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, who began large-scale movement into Europe around 3100 BCE. In 2018, Simon Rasmussen at the University of Copenhagen and colleagues published findings in Cell, reporting ancient DNA identification of Yersinia pestis in skeletal remains from Neolithic and Bronze Age burial sites across the Eurasian steppe and Baltic regions, dated to approximately 3000 to 2500 BCE. This strain of Yersinia pestis was distinct from the strain that caused the Black Death. It predated the flea-borne transmission vector. It lacked the gene flea-adapted Y pestis uses to block the flea's digestive tract and force regurgitation into the host, meaning it spread differently. Possibly through human body lice, possibly through respiratory contact, possibly through mechanisms that have not yet been identified. Its symptoms in an immunologically naive population are unknown. The Neolithic farmers of Europe, who had no prior exposure to this bacterium or any closely related organism, had no immunological preparation for it whatsoever. Between 3100 and 2500 BCE, the Neolithic farming population of Northern Europe, from Ireland across Scandinavia to the Baltic, collapsed by an estimated 40 to 60%. Johannes Müller at Kiel University, analyzing settlement archaeology across Northern Europe, documented the systematic abandonment of Neolithic settlements during this period. Longhouse communities occupied for centuries, left empty. Megalithic monuments, built but not maintained. Agricultural fields, abandoned. In Britain, a 2018 study in Nature by Selina Brace and colleagues at the Natural History Museum documented that the Neolithic population of Britain, the people who built Stonehenge, was replaced by over 90% within a few centuries of the Yamnaya expansion. The genetic data from some Scandinavian populations shows replacement approaching totality. This is not cultural diffusion, it is demographic elimination followed by population replacement. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. For decades, the accepted model for Bronze Age Europe assumed cultural diffusion. The Yamnaya brought their language, their metallurgy, and their pastoral practices to Europe through gradual migration and intermarriage, slowly mixing with and transforming the indigenous Neolithic populations. The ancient DNA evidence does not support this model. What it shows is not gradual mixture. It shows rapid collapse of one population and equally rapid expansion of another. The sequence is indistinguishable from what ancient DNA has documented in 16th century Central America. An existing population crashes, and a different population, carrying partial immunity to the pathogen that caused the crash, moves into the demographic vacuum. The mechanism in Europe cannot be confirmed with current data. The pattern it produced is unambiguous. The Neolithic farmers of Europe were not a primitive population on the edge of collapse. They were the builders of Stonehenge, Newgrange, the megalithic temples of Malta, the Karnak stone alignments of Brittany. They had maintained long-distance trade networks in polished stone, amber, and copper for centuries. They had developed agricultural techniques sufficient to sustain dense population concentrations across Western and Northern Europe for 3,000 years. They had astronomical knowledge sufficient to align multi-ton stone monuments to solstice and lunar events with precision that modern engineers have confirmed required careful, multi-generational planning. Whatever they believed, whatever language they spoke, whatever accumulated ecological and spiritual knowledge they had developed over 3,000 years of European civilization, died with them. We do not know their language. We do not know what they called the monuments they built. We do not know their cosmology, their social organization, their understanding of the natural world they had inhabited for 150 generations. The Yamnaya, who moved into their territory 4,700 years ago, also did not know. The monuments were inherited by a population with no cultural continuity to the builders. Modern Europeans speak Indo-European languages: English, German, French, Spanish, Russian, Greek, and descended from a language family brought to Europe by the Yamnaya pastoralists, not the Neolithic farmers. The Yamnaya. The people who built Stonehenge spoke a different language. It is gone. No text records it. No descendant language preserves it. The genetic study of ancient European populations is approximately 10 years old. What it has revealed in that decade, the scale and speed of a Bronze Age population replacement, driven by pathogen exposure, was not hypothesized before 2015. The ancient DNA program is still early. Most Bronze Age European sites have not been sampled. The question of how many similar replacements occurred before we developed the tools to detect them has a probable answer and a confirmed answer. The probable answer is several. The confirmed answer is at least one. We are only now learning how to ask the question. We do not yet know what other answers are waiting in the ground. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.